As the trial of Bryan Kohberger approaches, the world is watching closely. And what will this high-profile case reveal to us? Welcome to That's My Opinion, where we dive into today's biggest stories and spark honest conversations. My name's Bacon Bears, and today we're deep diving into the key details, the evidence, and what we might expect before the trial begins in 2025. But before we can look ahead to the trial, we need to revisit the horrific night of November 13th of 2022, when 4 young lives were tragically taken. Moscow, Idaho is a small, quiet town with a population of around 25,000, known for its picturesque landscapes and the presence of the University of Idaho. The college town offers a peaceful, tight-knit community where students and locals coexist. And historically, Moscow has been seen as a safe place until November of 2022. On November 13th of 2022 at 11:58 a.m., a 911 call was made requesting assistance for an unconscious individual inside of a home. Now let's take a closer look at the 911 call, as it's become a point of contention for some people discussing this case. The crime scene was extremely brutal, so many have questioned, how could someone call 911 and only request for an unconscious person? I came across an article explaining that it is actually standard protocol for a dispatcher to use the description unconscious person when the caller is frantic, agitated, or difficult to understand. This allows dispatchers to prioritize urgency without wasting valuable time and trying to gather specific details. They understand the need to send help immediately, even if they don't have all the information yet. It's important to remember that when someone is faced with such a horrifying scene, especially in their own home, they might struggle to gather their thoughts. The individuals who made the call were reportedly frantic, passing the phone back and forth as they were trying to figure out what was actually happening. So for those wondering why the 911 call was described in this way, it's because of situations like this. A dispatcher needs to act fast. And when police arrived at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho, the scene was unlike anything they had ever encountered before. 4 university students of Idaho, Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonzalez, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, had been brutally slain inside of their home in the middle of the night. But who would be capable of committing such a horrific act, and why? Even more pressing, where does the investigation even begin? And it seems that in this case, the police actually began their work the night before. So here's the timeline that we have. On November 12th of 2022 at 9 p.m., Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin, who are dating at the time, were having a night out together when they were seen at a party at Ethan's fraternity. And this was not far from the King Road house and where all the roommates lived. Parallel to that, Kaylee Gonzalez is uploading pictures on her Instagram, reflecting on her friendships with the caption, "One lucky girl to be surrounded by these people every day," including pictures of the 4 of them. By 10 p.m., Kaylee Gonzalez and Maddie Mogen went up to a bar called the Corner Club, and afterward they were seen ordering food from a food truck which was live streaming at the time. Xana and Ethan make it back to the King Road house by 1:45 a.m., and Maddie and Kaylee weren't far behind, arriving at the house around 1:56. The 2 other roommates who lived in the house were already there, having arrived around 1 a.m. The house on King Road was a 6-bedroom, 3-bathroom rental property used by the students. Ethan was the only one who didn't live there. He was just staying over for the night. Everyone went to sleep that night, unaware of the horrific events that were about to unfold. And as rumblings about this crime starts to make its way through Moscow, the police come out and let the public know that they did not believe there is an imminent threat and that this was an isolated, targeted attack. This was all based on their initial investigation, but they never let the public in on why they thought that. And some people were very upset by this, stating that it was irresponsible for them to do so. But others would argue that detectives are not going to show their best cards. So I can understand both sides. I want to know if my safety is at stake, but also, as law enforcement, they can't risk losing whatever insight they have on a case. And honestly, that has to be a tough spot to be in. However, with that being said, 3 days after making that statement publicly, they would take it back. They said that they did believe that this was a targeted incident. However, they could not say that there was no threat to the community, even going on to say, be aware of your surroundings at all times. Now, the community was understandably shaken by the brutal nature of this crime. However, at this point, we do know that the police had gathered some key evidence, including an eyewitness account of the perpetrator leaving the house. According to the affidavit, one of the roommates saw a man walking toward her. As he passed her, she stood frozen in shock, unable to comprehend what was happening, and it's hard to even imagine being in that scenario. A preliminary autopsy on the victims revealed that they had been attacked with a large knife and that they had died sometime after 2 a.m. From what I could find, they believe it was between 4 and 4:25 a.m. The wounds were described as, quote, pretty extensive. It's believed that the victims were likely asleep when they were attacked, though some had defensive wounds, which suggests that they may have woken up during the assault. Additionally, there was no sign of sexual assault. In a press conference on November 20th, the president of the University of Idaho said that the police continue to inform us that they believe that this was a targeted attack. And the community at this point is getting kind of frenzied because there just seems to be this lack of communication between the police and the public. And the Moscow police captain finally comes out and he's like, listen, we cannot put our investigation in jeopardy by releasing what we have. On November 25th, law enforcement agencies were asked to be on the lookout for a white Hyundai Elantra, which was seen on neighborhood surveillance video near the rental home. By November 30th, while everyone was waiting to hear anything, a vigil was held at the University of Idaho to honor the victims, and some of the families were even in attendance. Stephen Gonzalez, who is Kaylee's father, was there, and he said, "We're going to get our justice." He also added that his daughter, Kaylee, and Maddie Mogan had been best friends since the 6th grade, and he actually learned that they were in the same bed when they were killed. He states they went to high school together, then they started looking at colleges, they came here together, they eventually got into the same apartment together, and then in the end, they died together, which is oddly comforting and yet so sad. By December 2nd of 2022, the two housemates who were asleep at the time of the crimes released letters stating that they were struggling to accept what happened, which is completely understandable. At the time, there was like this weird public outcry, and this is why I hate the internet sometimes, but there was this outcry that they come forward or that they were a part of it, or why did they call the police at noon, or just so many things. And the treatment of these two students who probably already have horrific survival guilt was absolutely atrocious by just people online and just people in the public. I believe one of the girls had an ex-boyfriend and they tried to blame it on him, and he wasn't even like near there and had nothing to do with it, but people didn't want to believe it. It was a mess. I really don't understand how people take it to those lengths. However, by December 7th, the police are removing personal items from the apartment to give back to the families of the victims. And this is when they tell the public that they are looking for anyone who owns a Hyundai Elantra between 2011 and 2013, because that person may have critical information to share. And by December 15th, we start to see a frustration growing between the police and the parents of the victims. Christy Gonzalez, who is Kaylee's mom, goes on to the Today Show and expresses her frustration about hearing about the car when the public did. She said that it made her feel left in the dark, which as a mother, I cannot even begin to imagine. I would probably also be calling every single day. I don't know how you just sit back in a situation like that and like let other people handle it. I mean, I know you're supposed to because they're cops, but that's got to be so hard. You're just waiting. And I'm sure there's just so many emotions that go with it. You're nervous, you're scared, you're angry, you're in denial. Like it's got to be all the stages of grief that hit you at once. And on top of that, your hands are completely tied because there's nothing you can do. It just has to be absolutely brutal. However, as a rebuttal to that, on December 21st, the police chief tells NBC News that his department is in daily contact with the families and that he asked them to be patient as the investigation progresses. He insisted that it's not a cold case and that their end goal is to bring somebody to justice for those families and for those victims. December 30th, an arrest is made and we are introduced to 28-year-old Bryan Christopher Kohberger, who is a resident of Pullman, Washington. He's a student at Washington University, which I Googled, and it's only 11 minutes away from the University of Idaho. The arrest was made in Pennsylvania, 2,500 miles away from the Idaho campus, and he was arrested at his family home. But what do we know about who Bryan actually is? Bryan Christopher Kohberger was born on November 21st of 1994. He finished his associate's degree in psychology in 2018 at Northampton Community College, and then then got his bachelor's from DeSales University in 2020. At the time of his arrest, we know that he was a PhD criminology student and a teaching assistant at the Washington State University. We also know that in April of 2022, he interviewed for a job or an internship, I believe, with the local police department, in which he did not get. Reports about who Bryan is as a person vary depending on who you ask. Some describe him as calm and someone who is always looking for a way to fit in. In his younger years, he was reportedly friendly but faced bullying, particularly for his weight, with one account stating that much of this harassment came from females. Others recall that he was very into his books, sweet, and extremely quiet. He's also been reported as a very curious person and very interested in psychology even as a teen. However, other reports paint a completely different picture. Some claim that Bryan had a habit of finding the most complicated way to explain things, seemingly to showcase how intelligent he was, something few doubt about him. Contradictory accounts suggest that Bryan was, in fact, the bully. He was described as having anger issues, prone to outbursts, and physically aggressive, often smashing objects or punching walls. Additionally, he was known to get into heated arguments with other doctorate students. And what I find interesting is that most of these conflicts reportedly involved females. In one instance, a female student allegedly stormed out of the classroom accusing Bryan Kohberger of mansplaining. I can't say that word. There's an article that mentions Bryan had some troubling incidents at a local bar he frequented. The bar reportedly used an ID scanning system that allowed the staff to add notes about patrons. And according to one staff member, they added a note about Bryan that read, "Hey, this guy makes creepy comments. Keep an eye on him. He'll have 2 or 3 beers and then just get a little too comfortable." It was noted that Bryan often sat alone, observing the other patrons. He frequently asked female staff and customers about where they lived, which, please don't ever do that. And if they showed no interest in engaging with him, he was known to become upset. In one instance, he reportedly called a female staff member a bitch. When a male worker confronted him about his behavior, Bryan allegedly responded, "I don't know what you're talking about. You totally have me confused." And there's also a report that states while studying at DeSales University, Kohberger posted a now deleted call for participants on Reddit. The post was aimed at ex-convicts and claimed to be a part of a study sanctioned by the university. The purpose of the study was to examine how emotions and psychological traits influence decision-making when committing a crime. What I find most interesting, though, is how reports suggest that Bryan's behavior changed immediately after the crime occurred. According to a neighbor who spoke with CBS News on January 11th but wished to remain anonymous, Bryan even brought up the murders in casual conversation, seemingly having a keen interest in this crime in particular. The neighbor recalled, "He asked if I had heard about the murders, which I did, and then he said, yeah, seems like they have no leads. Seems like it was a crime of passion." Before the murders, Bryan was noted to be very quiet, but afterward he reportedly became more willing to talk, hold conversations, and seemed noticeably more lively. While working as a teaching assistant, one person who had him in that role mentioned that his behavior changed after November 12th of 2022. In October of 2022, Bryan had failed all of his students on a test and left several detailed comments on their work. However, after the crime, in November and December, his approach shifted significantly. He began handing out hundreds and left minimal comments on the students' assignments. But how do we go from such an incredibly heinous crime to an arrest in just 7 weeks? What links Bryan Kohberger to the 4 victims on King Road? One of the first key clues is the car, the white Hyundai Elantra. It was caught on surveillance video near the King Road home. And as we discussed, on December 7th, the police issue a public statement asking for information about the white Hyundai Elantra. What the public didn't know at the time was that local police had already been asked to locate the specific vehicle. And eventually, it was traced back to Bryan Kohberger. He owned the exact car. One of the key pieces of evidence in this case, though, is the DNA. A knife sheath was found at the crime scene next to 2 victims, partially under a comforter. When they first put the DNA into CODIS, there was no match. And CODIS, or Combined DNA Index System, is a database used by law enforcement to store and compare DNA from crime scenes, criminals, arrestees. It helps link DNA evidence to suspects and solve crimes faster. However, in this case, when there was no match, investigators actually turned to genealogical testing or family DNA to make a connection. The police sent the DNA to a private lab and tested it inside a public ancestry database like Ancestry.com. And within days, cousin matches begin to appear. Genealogists then start building a family tree, beginning with the closest relative that they could find. With the family DNA and the white Elantra, investigators now have Bryan Kohberger. They also discovered that he lives just 11 miles from the crime scene. The next step was tracking his cell phone, which led them to another key piece of evidence. They learned that Bryan had driven home to Pennsylvania for Christmas to be with his family. Investigators followed this lead and went to the family's home where they dug through the trash. They ran the DNA from the trash and found a match to Bryan's father, Michael. The DNA was then tested against the DNA found on the knife sheath. The results suggested that Michael is likely the father of whoever left the DNA on the sheath, further linking Bryan to the crime. And with all of this evidence, investigators had enough to arrest Bryan Kohberger. He was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and burglary. On the same day of his arrest, they collected his DNA through a buccal swab or a cheek swab. And this was crucial because when they tested his DNA against a sample from the knife sheath, the results showed that the DNA was at least 5.37 octillion, yes, octillion, I've never said that word before today, times more likely to belong to Bryan Kohberger than anyone else. And just to give you an idea of what an octillion is, it is a 1 followed by 27 zeros. After his arrest, investigators began digging into every single detail of his life. They found that Bryan followed all 3 female victims on Instagram and messaged at least one of them. While none of the girls followed him back, reports show that 2 weeks before the murders, he sent a series of messages to one of them. Additionally, he was actively liking posts from Maddie's Instagram, further then tying him to the crime. While I couldn't confirm exactly who Bryan was messaging, there are reports suggesting that he sent repeated messages to one of the victims, simply saying, "How are you?" but over and over and over again. And there was never a response to those messages. The messages were described as persistence, but there was never a sign of frustration when going unanswered. But what's interesting, and very sad in this case, about Instagram messages is that they can sometimes go unnoticed because they may land in a different message folder. Like, for example, the message requests box. I actually had something similar happen to me recently when one of my aunts messaged me and I completely missed it because it went into that folder and it doesn't notify you when it does that. We also know that his cell phone pinged near the house just hours after the crime, and also 12 different times leading up to the crime, insinuating that he was in fact stalking the victims and or this house. Other key evidence was seized from Bryan Kohberger's apartment in Pullman, Washington. Among the items were a pillow with reddish-brown stains, a disposable glove, a dozen strands of hair, a stained mattress cover, a computer tower, receipts, a dust container from a Bissell Power Force vacuum, an Amazon Fire Stick with a cord and a plug, and a possible animal hair strand, which I believe the roommates had a dog, or somebody in that house had a dog. Investigators also searched his office at Washington State University and executed a search warrant at his family's home in Pennsylvania. There they found 4 medical-style gloves, a silver flashlight, a white t-shirt, a Washington State Cougars sweatshirt, a pair of Nike shoes, black shorts, black boxers, and a pair of socks. As we move into the judicial part of this case, it's important to remember that Bryan Kohberger has not been found guilty. All statements made against him are allegations until proven in a court of law. Kohberger has stated that he believes that he will be exonerated from this crime. Jason Labar, who was Bryan Kohberger's public defender at the time, stated, "He should be presumed innocent until proven otherwise and not be tried in the court of public opinion." Also adding, Mr. Kohberger is eager to be exonerated of these charges and looks forward to resolving these matters as promptly as possible. However, if Bryan Kohberger is in fact found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder and burglary, he could face the death penalty. Now, there's a lot of back and forth as they work to get this trial ready to go. And I have to say, after covering so many cases, I find our judicial system fascinating just because of how much back and forth there is in the process. It's like a weird tennis match. But to keep this nice and tidy, I'm going to go through a timeline so that we don't get anything confused. Now, remember Bryan Kohberger is arrested on December 30th. On December 31st, he waives his extradition hearing to face charges in Idaho, and this is agreeing to be transferred to the state that you are wanted in without going through the formal legal process. And sometimes people can do this to potentially seem more cooperative or perhaps seek a plea deal. He's then transferred and booked into the Latah County, Idaho jail, and he is held without bail, and a pretrial hearing is set for January 12th. Now, if you don't know, a pretrial hearing is a legal meeting that happens before the actual trial starts. It's where the judge and the lawyers for both prosecution, who is trying to prove the crime, and the defense, who is defending the person accused of the crime, discuss important details about the case. During this hearing, they might decide what evidence can be shown or not shown in court, discuss any legal issues that could affect the trial, set dates for the trial, and other hearings. They talk about any motions or requests that need to be decided, like whether certain evidence is allowed or not. The goal is to make sure that the trial goes as smoothly as possible. And just know when I give you these little blurbs about something, it's because I had to look them up myself because I wanted to have a better idea of what it actually is. So we are going to do some learning together. In March of 2023, prosecutors sought data from several sources, including Apple, Amazon, social media platforms, retailers, bank accounts, Google, DoorDash, Meta, Snapchat, Tinder, Walmart, and K-Bar Knives. Then in April of 2023, one of the surviving roommates filed a motion to quash or reject a subpoena that would require her to testify at the preliminary hearing. The defense believes that she actually has information that could clear Bryan Kohberger, but she insists that she does not. However, she did agree to be interviewed. And at this time, Latah County also returns an indictment stating he did unlawfully enter a home in Moscow, Idaho, and then did willfully, unlawfully, deliberately, and with premeditation and with malice aforethought kill and murder. And then, this is wild, during his arraignment, he says nothing. The judge asks him to enter a plea, and he just stands silent. So then John Judge has to enter the plea for him, and he enters not guilty, which I cannot imagine. If you're just going to enter a not guilty plea anyways, why wouldn't you just say that? By June of 2023, Bryan Kohberger's attorney claimed that there was no connection between him and the victims. They also stated that other male DNA was found at the crime scene. Though the question remains, was it found on the knife sheath? That's a key detail, as it directly links the suspect to the crime. The defense further criticized the use of genetic genealogy, calling it a bizarrely complex DNA tree experiment. They also pointed out the lack of any DNA from the victims at Kohberger's house, car, or office, raising questions. His attorney, J. Weston Logsdon, says that another man's DNA was found on a glove outside and in the house. In June, this is also when we find out that the prosecutors have decided to pursue the death penalty for Bryan Kohberger. By July of 2023, Bryan Kohberger's lawyers asked for his indictment to be thrown out, arguing that the grand jury was given the wrong information about what proof is needed to charge him. They say the standard should be beyond a reasonable doubt, but they claim that the grand jury was told something different. Presentment, which only means that there's a reasonable belief that the defendant committed the crime. And this kind of mistake can be serious because it affects the fairness of the trial. But this was rejected. In August of 2023, we now have maybe an alibi. Attorneys for Bryan Kohberger claim that he was going for a routine drive when the crime took place, stating that he has a long habit of going on long drives alone and that he did that night and that morning. Bryan Kohberger also waives his right to a speedy trial, and this will give the defense more time to prepare his case. They also have decided that they want to strike the death penalty and ban cameras in the courtroom. And as this trial was supposed to happen on October 2nd of 2023, it ends up getting postponed. And I find some of these facts so interesting because it's just something that like normal people like ourselves don't even think about. But on October 31st of 2023, federal investigators go to the King Road home to build an exact replica of the house to use at the trial. which is so crazy to me. I mean, I get why you have to do it, but that level of expertise, my little brain cannot comprehend. So then we move into 2024, the year that I am currently making this video, and the judge states that the trial won't start until 2025. And the Gonzalez family and the Kernodle family are very upset, which is completely understandable. I mean, I can't even begin to understand what these families are feeling. And this is a quote directly from them. "We want to start healing. We do. We want to find justice and try to move on from this horrible tragedy. So please, please start making some decisions, get to work, and quit playing the delay game." And the judge comes back in his own statement and says, "I'm trying to be fair and realistic about when we could really be ready for a trial, and I only want to do it once," which I also understand. Because if anything is left out and Bryan truly is the killer and he ends up getting away with it, that's all you have. You don't have more chances. So if the judge truly believes that they have a good case, I'm sure he wants them to be able to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. In April of 2024, Bryan Kohberger's lawyers updated their alibi defense, claiming that the cell phone data will show that he liked to hike and take drives, but he was actually miles away from the crime scene. Additionally, Kohberger's lawyers argue that the death penalty violates his constitutional rights. The prosecution responded by pointing out the severity of this crime, stating that Kohberger broke into a home, fatally stabbed 4 students, showed a complete disregard for human life, and demonstrated a natural tendency or propensity to commit murder. And if he is truly convicted of this case, and you're like, the death penalty goes against his constitutional rights, he lost all of those when he committed murder on 4 people. They also say that multiple murders tells us nothing of the culpability of the offender. What? And then they argue that the additional crime of the burglary was done solely to commit the murder, thus making it an inherent part of the crime and not an additional aggravator. Because somehow that's better. Honestly, I am not sure what amount of money you could pay me to be a defense attorney. I would love to talk to a defense attorney because that has to be one of the top 5 worst jobs in the world. They also decided that this will be held outside of Latah County, 300 miles away in Ada County, and the trial will also see a new judge, and that'll be Judge Stephen Hippler. And the trial date has been set yet again for August 11th of 2025. And from what I could find, I actually believe that this trial will be live streamed. So I would be very interested in watching that live myself. And as we have all the main points that we need going into the trial, to me, this is not the most important part of the case. And that's why I saved this part for last. I want to make sure that the last memory that you have leaving this video is about Kaylee Gonzalez, Madeline Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. These were 4 young people who were at the point of their lives that they were just about to begin living, and yet their lives were so senselessly cut short. Kaylee Gonzalez was one of 5 kids. She's been described as the ultimate middle child. She was constantly chasing adventure, had a ton of spirit, and was just a little princess. In the 6th grade, she would meet Maddie Mogan, and they were best friends from day one. They were as close as sisters. Maddie Mogan loved pink, and her father said that she was the light of his life. They were so happy, and they would just embrace life fully. Xana Kernodle was an active athlete. She played volleyball, track, soccer, and she was currently majoring in marketing. She loved her dog and her family, and in turn, everyone loved Xana. Xana and Ethan Chapin were dating at the time, and they were called the perfect couple. Ethan Chapin was actually a triplet, and they all had just turned 20. The siblings were also students at the University of Idaho, and his parents described him as an easy kid. Ethan worked at a tulip farm and always smiled. They said he was absolutely in love with Xana, and his parents said that if the world lived like Ethan did, the world would be a better place. One of the things that I found so different about this case is that they really did make it about these 4 kids. The media and the public really focused on each of these individuals. This heartbreaking case reminds us how precious life can be and how quickly it can be taken away. Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan were deeply loved, and their loss has left a lasting impact on their families and their community. It's a reminder to hold our loved ones close and support each other through hard times. Thank you guys for watching this video. Thank you guys for supporting my channel. Thank you to new members. I will see you guys next time. My name is Bacon Bears, and that's my opinion.